Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. We post these conversations on average once a week as part of the larger mission of the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine, a 501c3 nonprofit educational organization devoted to promoting science and reason. We depend upon and appreciate your support. So if you find this podcast valuable, along with our magazine and the other projects we work on, please support us at skeptic.com/donate. There you can support our work through a one-time and recurring donations via PayPal, monthly donations via Patreon, a direct donation via Shop Skeptic, by check in the mail, and old school, by phone. To that end, I want to thank everyone who donated to our annual fundraising drive this year, which we depend upon to meet our annual budget in support of our many science education projects. This Science Salon podcast, for example, grew out of our original Caltech Distinguished Science Lecture Series, which then morphed into our Science Salon live events. And now, thanks to technology, we can produce weekly dialogues with leading scientists and scholars on a variety of topics. My guest for this episode is the renowned evolutionary behavioral scientist and Concordia University professor Dr. Gad Saad. Starting with his escape to Canada from war-torn Lebanon, Dr. Saad recounts how he got interested in the study of human nature in general, and consumer behavior in particular, through the evolutionary lens. Why people make the choices they do in the marketplace. Why evolutionary psychology is an equal opportunity offender to both the political left and the right. What's wrong with the blank slate model of human nature? What it means to hypothesize that something evolved for an adaptive reason. How evolutionary psychologists test their claims. The consilience of human knowledge. Epistemological humility. Postmodernism and how it has corrupted the academy. And finally, the vital importance of free speech and free inquiry in science and society. Dr. Gad Saad held the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption from 2008 to 2018. He is the author of The Consuming Instinct, 2011, Prometheus Books, and The Evolutionary Bases of Consumption, 2007, Lawrence Erlbaum. He's the editor of Evolutionary Psychology in Business Sciences, 2011, from Springer. And he is finishing his next book on idea pathogens and how they have spread like a contagion in the academy, now spilling out into government and corporations. He's also the host of the popular podcast, The Sad Truth, which focuses on science, religion, political correctness, multiculturalism, postmodernism, third-wave feminism, Islam, safe spaces, trigger warnings, and many other topics. I've been a guest on that show a couple of times, and Gad is just one of the most interesting podcasters working today. So with that introduction, I give you Dr. Gad Saad. This is your host, Michael Shermer, and you're listening to Science Salon, a series of conversations with leading scientists, scholars, and thinkers about the most important issues of our time. So let's give our listeners a little bit of a background, in case they haven't seen your many appearances on Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin and so on, where you've talked about coming from Lebanon to, well, first the United States for your graduate training.
First to Canada, first to Montreal.
Canada. All right.
Grew up there from the age of 11.
Right.
Then left to the United States to pursue my MS and PhD. Then came back to Montreal.
Okay, all right. And now now you're in California, another foreign country.
California, it's not Israel, the promised land. California is the promised land.
Right.
I spent 2 years at University of California, Irvine, as a visiting professor, hoping that it would potentially turn into a permanent position. It didn't. And so I went back to the cold of Montreal, kicking and screaming. And California's always been sort of a second home to me because I've been coming here since the mid-'80s.
Right.
I have a brother here. I have other family members here. I worked at UC Irvine. So it really feels like a second home.
Right. So you're here every year and you hit all the media stuff while you're here. And you guys are staying in Newport Beach, which is super nice.
That's right.
Yeah, well, that's a cool background. But the way you got here was not so pleasant, right? I mean, you guys had to escape Lebanon during the Civil War.
So we're Lebanese Jews. We were part of the last group of Jews that had remained in Lebanon. what would happen in Lebanon is, as the animus between Israel and the Arab states would, wax and wane, it would become a bit more precarious to be Jewish in Arab countries. And so much of my extended family had left Lebanon, and we were really part of the last bastion of Lebanese Jews, very few left. And then when the Civil War broke out, it became truly untenable to be Jewish in Lebanon. And so we lasted for the first year of the Civil War, part of the first year, but then we really had to leave.
What's the dates on this? Early
so this
70s?
is mid-70s.
Mid-70s, yeah.
And so we left end of October. I had just turned, my birthday is October 13th. I had just turned 11.
Oh, boy.
And I went from bombs raining on my head to snow raining on my head.
Wow. How did you process that? At age 10, 11, you kind of know what's going on. But
I knew. I mean, I always tell people, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so dogged in my fight for liberty and freedom in the West, because Westerners don't really know how well they have it here.
Right.
When you come from lands like the one I come from, and you see how ugly human nature can manifest itself, and how you shouldn't be taking freedoms for granted, then you really get upset when you see some of these intrusions against freedom happening in the West. And that's why I'm so dogged in my defense of liberty.
So when a student says they're just trying to survive at a 4-year university
I'm not
in the United
impressed.
States, you're not impressed.
I'm not trying.
Yeah.
Well, that's another reason why I fight against this so-called snowflake generation and the social justice warriors, because it really is frustrating to see people manufacture a faux victimhood narrative. There are real people who truly suffer around the world. Let's leave our sympathy and empathy to them and not manufacture this garbage.
This is kind of a behavioral psychology problem in terms of adjusting your standards for what you're willing to accept.
Right.
To me, it's a mark of moral progress that yesterday's students protested the Vietnam War, now they protest Halloween costumes. So on the one hand, it's absurd, but on the other hand, it shows how far up our standards have become. Like, what are we willing to tolerate? And so it's probably a good reminder to have people like you say, hey, it could be much worse. None of this is inevitable.
Exactly.
It could all go south.
Right.
And you've been there to see that.
And you were asking, how did I process it when I was 10 and 11? You realize that you could die at any moment. But as a child, I think you're also protected by a bit of innocence. So when I think back now of the number of ways that we could have been killed, for example, simply stepping out of your house, there were snipers everywhere, that all they did was blow people up without knowing who they are. Just that's all they did. Snipers all over the place. We used to either jump underneath the table or not as a function of the whistle of the bombs coming our way.
Oh my God.
So you talk about the behavioral plasticity and the malleability and the adaptive nature, adaptive response of humans. Well, we learned that depending on that whistle signature, the bomb is not going to really hit here. It's going to hit 3-4 houses down, so we're safe, versus the way the whistle is coming, it's going to hit close. So all of these things were part of my daily reality for that first year.
So when you entered college, did you know what you wanted to major in? Like, I want to understand human nature, so I understand the problems of my country, or did you stumble into...
I didn't so much link it to my personal history. I always knew I wanted to be a professor. There were two things that I was very passionate about: soccer and academia. And I was lucky to be very good at both. And so my goal was to play professional soccer and then become a professor. Then I had some injuries, so that sort of accelerated entering the professorship. I knew that I was very interested in quantitative things. So my undergrad was in mathematics and computer science.
Oh, wow.
But then I always had an interest in the behavioral sciences. I even had thought at one point about clinical psychology or psychiatry. But then I felt quite disillusioned by, I don't know if you know the book by Robin Dawes, 1994, House of Cards.
Oh, yes.
That book was very influential on me because, although I had also read other psychoanalytic and psychotherapeutic stuff that seemed like a bunch of gunk. And so even though I had this desire to help people through psychotherapy, I felt that so much of it was BS, and I was very much coming from a scientific background. So I dropped the idea of going into clinical. So I was looking for something that was behavioral. Now, what should it be? I did an MBA where I became very interested in consumer behavior, psychology of decision making, and so on. So when I went for my PhD at Cornell, I met up with a gentleman by the name of Jay Russo, who's I don't know if you know him.
I've heard of him.
Yeah. So he's a top psychologist, a big mathematical and cognitive psychologist. And so he had suggested that I take a course with Professor Dennis Regan, who is a social psychologist at Cornell. And about halfway through the semester, Professor Regan assigned a book by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson called Homicide, two of the pioneers of evolution psychology. Now, I was interested in studying consumer behavior. I read that book, I have my evolutionary epiphany, and that's where I decided that I would apply that evolutionary lens to the study of decision-making and consumer behavior.
Right. That was a book where they quantified that stepfathers were far more likely to be violent.
100 times. That factor is 100 times more predictive of abuse than anything else.
Right.
And that's the beauty of that.
Although it's quick to point out that most stepfathers do not abuse their stepchildren, but those who do abuse their children are more likely to be step-parents.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And it's interesting that you sort of had to give that little caveat. But one of the things that you often get from detractors of EP, evolutionary psychology, is when you explain something like child abuse or rape or infidelity, people think that you are offering scientific justification for that reality, or that you're condoning it. And the rebuttal that I always offer is the following. To argue that is like saying that an oncologist is justifying cancer, is pro-cancer. But it is incredible how much that dragon, no matter how many times you slay it, it comes back alive.
Right. Well, and also in science, we have to explore the exceptions. Like, for example, depression is a predictor for suicide, but most depressed people don't commit suicide.
Exactly.
And some people who kill themselves or attempt to kill themselves were not depressed.
That's right.
So, you have to look at the four boxes of
the four cells.
The four cells. I just did this with movies. It was a talking head on a documentary about haunted horror movies. So these are horror movies like The Exorcist, where something bad happens to the actors, or during the shooting someone's killed or whatever. It's like, okay, but what about all the horror movies where nothing unusual happens? What are you talking about? We're not interested in those. Like, I know, but you got to be, because the exceptions test the rule you're trying to.
A classic example of that is something called the cell A bias, where you say something like the following: how come every time I'm in the shower the phone rings? Well, of course, it's because you didn't code the three other cells. Your brain doesn't code the non-recurrences, so you get the false sense that cell happens more often than it really does.
Yeah, I kind of had a similar track. I went initially into astronomy. My first class in college was an astronomy course. I thought, this is it. I want to be an astronomer. Then I realized how much math is involved in physics. I'm like, okay, I can see I'm not too good at that. So then I got interested in the social sciences, but mainly I had a couple of professors as an undergraduate, and they had a great life. It's like, this is what I want to do, more than the field, the professorship, because
you like that lifestyle,
the autonomy.
Yeah, the autonomy.
And these guys were 3 month summer and the Christmas vacation for a couple of weeks and so on. And it's like they're gone Friday morning by 10. They're gone for the weekend. And
but this doesn't mean that they're not working. It just means that they have autonomy.
That's right.
I work 18-hour days, but I decide when I work.
That's right.
Yeah.
I thought, boy, that's a good life. And then I went to Pepperdine and I ended up majoring in psych, and I took an abnormal psych class. Now I'm about 10 years older than you. I think I'm 64. You're 54. Yeah. So this was the year that Bob Rosenhan did his Being Sane in Insane Places experiment, where he sent his graduate students into mental institutions to report that they had heard voices and were feeling kind of blue and so on, and get themselves checked in, and now try to get out. And it's such and so our abnormal psych professor played this interview. This was on a cassette tape. It was so great. I still have the cassette tape, and it still works, by the way. That where he talked about once they got in, then everything was interpreted through the lens of this person is insane. Like, they were bored out of their skulls, these graduate students in these mental institutions like Camarillo State Hospital. Up in Camarillo. It's a terrible place. It's like the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest kind of thing, right? So they're bored, they're taking notes, they're writing, they're doing painting and this stuff. And this gets recorded in the psychiatrist's notebook. Patient exhibits excessive writing behavior, clearly erupting these emotional conflicts. And I heard that, thought, this is bullshit, this abnormal stuff.
Very much like my response.
Yeah, exactly. And then I had a professor who had a early 20s daughter who was having depression and some other issues. He said, would you like to just try talking to her to see how you like clinical stuff? And I mean, just like 2 hours with this young woman, I thought, clinical is not for me.
Yeah.
It's not that, it's not good to have somebody to talk to or somebody to listen. It's just, that's not my thing. And
I think in my case, I have sort of two opposing forces that affected my decision to leave clinical. On the one hand, I'm very much of a helper. I want to come in and sort of be the heroic savior, if I can put it that way. On the other hand, I'm maladaptively sensitive, so that if I see a dog that's being abused on the street, it might ruin the next month. I'll be ruminating about how bad he's feeling. And so I thought that personality trait was probably not a good one to have. I mean, it's nice to be caring, but it's not good to internalize every single problem that you're going to end up hearing every day. That's a quick path to suicide.
I think there's a temperament difference between people that go into experimental psych or clinical psych, or whatever the division would be these days, but that's what it was then. And our normal psych professor sent us to Camarillo State Hospital to spend the summer, working as an intern. So I did that. I was just so depressed. It was just like dragging my ass home wanting to put my head in the oven, and it's just like, I don't know how these people do it. Some people do it. Now, to me, I would like, for example, reading about studies of clinical trials on different drugs in psychiatric hospitals. That interests me.
Yes.
But the actual, that guy there with schizophrenia, now go spend time with him, it's like, I just can't do it.
Yeah. And I guess, I'll tell you a quick story from UC Irvine when I was a professor there. So at one point I was teaching an MBA class where a lot of the students were nighttime students who, many of them came from the medical profession. So they were typically physicians or various mental health practitioners who were getting an MBA. So at one point in one of my classes, I'm talking about psychoanalytic approaches and how these have been taken in marketing.
Right.
This was a consumer psychology course.
Right.
So, for example, word association, right? Word association comes originally from psychoanalysis. Right. I say mother, and you say Hitler. Okay, let's dig deep. Okay. Well, that word association was taken up by marketers, where they want to know what is your latent, association with Mercedes.
Right.
But you might not want to say that it's because I'm a show off and I want to just show that I'm, powerful. So what's the first word that comes to mind when you think of Mercedes? So in talking about these psychoanalytic approaches, at one point I started really attacking many of the utter BS that many of the original psychoanalysts, Freud and Jung and so on, came up with. So at the end of the class, a very demure, very respectful student comes up to me. She says, Professor Saad, I just want to tell you, I'm a psychiatrist by training. Thank you so much for attacking these guys. Because when I was a psychiatrist in training, whenever we would hear about all these theories, we didn't feel, the confidence to attack some of this. It felt so wrong. So it's nice to have someone with your stature.
Right.
So that shows you that even someone who was trained in psychiatry did not have the strength to say a lot of this stuff is utter BS.
Right. And the other thing, when we first started Skeptic here in '92, people started sending me stuff about Thomas Saaz. If you guys are skeptics, you should be skeptical of psychiatry. So I started reading Saaz, and I remember the Bob Rosenhan experiment, and it's like, this is all bullshit. There's no, wait a minute, there is such a thing as mental illness.
Of course.
It's not socially constructed. I read Foucault's book, it's like Madness and Civilization.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Madness was invented in 1667 in Europe. What do you mean invented? Okay, I understand there's a cultural context.
It's a social construct.
Yeah, but it's not, there's brain chemistry.
Right.
And it's surely that, genetics, these things have to make some sort of difference.
Well, you asked me, I think offline, we were talking about whether we were going to discuss postmodernism or not. And so the three French postmodernists, the gurus, I call them the original bullshitters, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan, I think, was a trained psychiatrist. Does that sound right?
I think so.
Now, I know we're not going to talk much about postmodernism, but there's a story that I've told on a few occasions that's worth repeating to this audience. If there's no overlap. So in 2002, I think, I had been invited by one of my former doctoral students who had just defended his dissertation out for dinner. Myself, my wife, we didn't have children then, and his date for that evening. And prior to going out to dinner, he gives me a heads up. He says, I just want to let you know that my date is she had the holy trinity of bullshit.
Okay.
She was a radical feminist who was a cultural anthropologist, all cultures are equal and so on, and a postmodernist. I said, oh boy.
Right.
I said, but basically he's warning me, please let's not have any big nasty debates.
Okay,
This is about celebration. I said,
let's talk about soccer.
Right. Let's talk about soccer. Mum's the word. I'm going to be on my best behavior, which of course I didn't stay true to that. At one point during the dinner, very politely, I asked her, so I hear you're a postmodernist. She said, yes. I said, so is it correct to say that the starting position is that there are no objective truths? Everything is subjective, of course, other than the one objective truth that there are no objective truths. She says, yeah, absolutely. I said, okay, well, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, so of course I study things like human universals. Do you mind if I take a crack at throwing some what I consider to be human universals, and then you can show me how they're contextualized, they're contingent, they're relative, and so on. Absolutely, go for it.
Wow. And your friend is going, oh no!
Exactly. By the way, I've told him recently that thank you so much for that dinner, because I've gotten so much mileage out of that story for the past 16 years. So I said, okay, let's start with this one. Is it true that within Homo sapiens, only women bear children? Is that a human universal? So she scoffs at my sexism. Yeah. She's disgusted by my stupidity and says, absolutely not. I said, no, it's not true. She goes, no. Well, there is a tribe off some Japanese island where in the spiritual realm, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting the definition of childbearing to the biological, the material realm, that's how you keep us, barefoot and pregnant.
Whoa.
So then when I always joke when I say when I recovered from my partial stroke after that idiocy, I said, okay, well, let's not maybe discuss something as controversial as who bears children. Let's remove all these kinds of sex differences, that minefield of danger. How about this? How about from the vantage point of anywhere on Earth, have sailors since time immemorial relied on the following universal: the sun rises in the east and sets in the west.
He went straight to physics.
What do you think you have an idea how she...
No, I don't know how you'd spin doctor that one.
Okay, well, there she used Derrida's Deconstructionism. She basically said, well, first of all, what do you mean by east and west? And secondly, that which you call the sun, now this is literally true, I'm not being hyperbolic. That which you call the sun, I call dancing hyena. I said, great. So then the dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west.
You call it
the dancing hyena is what I have. I have to put dancing hyena lotion to protect myself against dancing hyena burn when I go to the Caribbean. I won't play those labeling games. Now, she wasn't an anomaly. She wasn't a freak who misunderstood postmodernism. She was aping all that nonsense.
Right.
And I've been immersed in that stuff because I straddle both the natural sciences and the social sciences, right? And a lot of the stuff that I see in the social sciences that is hinged with all kinds of, that's laced with all kinds of postmodernism, it's all garbage.
Yeah.
So my position is there's very, very little that we've benefited from postmodernism.
Yeah. In the history of science profession, it kind of went through this in the 80s when I switched and got my doctorate in history of science from psychology. Should have stuck with psych, I think. But in any case, it was just starting to go through that kind of deconstruction, postmodernism. In terms of the context of science being practiced by a community of people in which the culture kind of dictates the sorts of questions you're interested in asking about nature. So I could, okay, that's a good point there. So I could see some of the points that they make, like for example, like with ADHD kids, there's a huge spike in diagnoses of ADHD, and then the medications are applied. Okay, so I could see the argument that really little kids that just are high energy, like little boys that want to run around, and they don't want to sit in rows of desks for 8 hours in a day with a few breaks in between, and that the medicating them to calm down and keep them in the desk so that they don't run around, that would be an example. It seems like you're calling it some sort of disorder when really it's just a contextualized.
Right.
If this kid lived 100 years ago and he's on a farm, he'd be running around and all that energy would be great. So there, Foucault's example of the sort of social construction of madness, I wouldn't apply it to schizophrenia, but something lighter like that, I can see their argument there.
Right. So basically you have an edifice of 100 buildings of BS, and you have to go to building 83 in the corner to pick up that one nugget.
Right.
But the rest of the edifice is just stacked with BS, right? So, for example, if I were to read, as a matter of fact, I have read grant applications coming from graduate students, most of whom were postmodernist types. I read 40, 50 grants. it was utter pure gibberish. I mean, literally the gibberish that you would get from the grievance studies hoax, right? So how could it be, right? I mean, think about it. If you're studying neuroscience, or if you're studying literature seriously, or so I'm not a science elitist that only if you study biology or psychology or mathematics you're serious, but if you study Shakespeare you're not. I'm not arguing that. But you can't depart from reason, from logic. Now, if I'm reading 40, 50, 60 grant applications, of which not one am I able to know whether that is part of Pete Boghossian's satire or not. That's not, the ratio of BS to good nuggets is not a good one. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, we did an issue of Skeptic on this argument in the mid-90s about were the Egyptians black. There was this a 3-volume series called Black Athena. And the argument was that the Greeks got Greek philosophy, so-called Greek philosophy, from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians were not red, they were black. And therefore, Western culture owes its allegiance to black culture. And therefore, it elevates Africa. You know the argument.
Of course.
Okay, so, but then I interviewed some anthropologists and archaeologists about this. Only a late 20th century American would ask the question, were the Egyptians red or black? Egyptians would not have, like, what are you talking about? What has this got to do with anything? So that would be an example of the culture telling science, go study this question because we want to know the answer. Okay, why are we even asking this question? It's like, why there's gender differences in whatever cognitive abilities or athletic abilities. Why are we interested in that? I mean, this is a very late 20th century American obsession. My wife's from Germany, and one of her observations of American culture is you guys just talk about race all the time. It just doesn't come up in Germany. We talk about the Turks or these people we don't like.
Well, it came up about 70, 75 years ago.
Yes, that's right.
In a big way.
Oh, but believe me, the Germans are bending over back. These are the nicest people. We don't want to offend anybody.
And hence, Merkel's opened the self-flagellation. I'm bad. I want to.
So some of that's good. But let's go back to your science. So now you're entering social science. I think when you did this, something like behavioral evolutionary economics was not really on the radar as a big thing.
No, absolutely not. So I actually was my first semester, the same semester where I took Professor Regan's advanced social psychology course, where I was exposed to the book Homicide. I also took last year's Nobel Prize winner, who's a professor of mine, Richard Thaler.
You had Dick Thaler?
I had Dick Thaler.
Oh my God, he's now a legend.
My pedigree is a pretty strong one, if I may say. So I took Dick Thaler's course, the behavioral decision-making stuff. My doctoral supervisor, Jay Russo, his first paper ever published, if I'm not mistaken, in the late 60s, was with Amos Tversky.
Oh, wow.
So I was steeped into the Tversky, Kahneman, Thaler stuff. One of the biggest behavioral decision-making groups was at Cornell. And so in my doctoral dissertation, I studied something called stopping policies. When is it that you've acquired enough information to stop acquiring additional information and commit to a choice, right? Contrary to the classical economic idea of I need to look at all of the available and relevant information so that I can maximize my utility. We don't do that, right? When you bought your last car, you didn't look at all of the available information. You looked at some subset of information, and then somehow you reached a stopping decision. I've seen enough. I'm ready to choose the Mazda or the Tesla. Well, I took this idea and I modeled through various experiments these stopping thresholds. So I really came out of that behavioral decision-making, demonstrating that the classical economists are wrong in their thinking. But I started becoming disillusioned with, I'm not sure if I'm the first one to come up with this term, what I call, but maybe someone else has called it also, the violation of the month club. Right? So
I haven't heard that.
So I don't feel comfortable taking credit for it because I don't know if I came up with it or I'd heard it from someone else. Concept? So the idea basically is that what Tversky and Kahneman did, and I'm certainly not denigrating them here. They're giants. I mean, they're off the charts, fantastic. But what their tradition ultimately ended up doing for the past 40 and 50 years is there is this Homo economicus creature that exists only in the deep recesses of the economist's mind,
right.
where there are these axioms of rational choice. So if I prefer car A to car B and I prefer car B to car C, then I must prefer car A to car C. That's called the transitivity axiom.
Right.
So there's a bunch of these axioms of rational choice that anyone who is considered rational, according to that axiomatic definition of rationality, has to abide by them. And if you don't do that, then you're being irrational. What Kahneman and Tversky did first, and then Thaler did later in behavioral finance, is demonstrate that no, Homo economicus is not real. We all violate these tenets. Okay, good. So I argued, maybe somewhat facetiously, that if I were a physiologist or an anatomist, if I spend the next 40 years demonstrating that our liver doesn't function similar to the liver of the unicorn, well, but who cares? The unicorn doesn't exist.
Right.
I'm much more interested in studying not so much the cataloging of these biases,
right.
but rather why has our brain evolved to have the architecture that it has. And that's when I then decided to very much infuse all my thinking with the evolutionary lens.
Why would natural selection not create a utility maximizer?
You're asking this rhetorically, or you're just repeating what I'm saying?
No.
Oh, yeah, that's great. So the classic example would be this. Males have evolved to spread their seeds, so why aren't we all sitting at a sperm bank donating?
Right.
Well, David Buss, I think, whom I think you know,
Yeah,
David Buss,
David,
the pioneer of certainly the evolutionary roots of mating preferences, argued, well, there is no domain general mechanism called increase your fitness.
Right.
Evolutionary psychologists, and actually I'm so glad you asked this question because it's a segue to explaining what evolutionary psychologists think of the human mind. Evolutionary psychologists argue that the human mind has evolved various computational systems, each of which solves a specific adaptive problem. So find mate, retain mate, avoid predators, avoid poisonous or toxic foods, build coalitions, invest in kin. So this is called the Swiss Army knife metaphor, right? So in the same way that a Swiss Army knife has different blades, each of which serves a specific function that is not transferable to another domain, that's how evolutionary psychologists view the human mind. So there is no such thing as a domain general mechanism called fitness maximize.
Right.
There are specific Swiss Army knife tools that operate in specific domains.
Right. So behavioral finance, you've just debunked the myth of Homo economicus. We're not utility maximizers from an evolutionary perspective. There's no general utility maximizer in our genome or whatever. But so what happens when we have these like competing motives? So I'm standing there before a wall of toothpaste. Some people will look at every tube and look at the price and so on. People like me, I just go through, I like the blue one, boom, and it goes and I'm off to the next one. So there must be personality differences?
Yeah, there are many. And so I spent a whole lecture in my consumer psychology seminar where I discuss how personality affects choice.
Oh.
And so to answer your question, one very appropriate personality trait for what you're talking about is something called maximizer versus satisficer.
Oh, right.
Right? So this is the Barry Schwartz stuff. He wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice. Why is it the paradox of choice? Because it turns out that if you have more choice, it's not always better, which again is an attack on classical economics, right? Because you get pissed off when you have too many choices. You get sort of paralysis. There's too many choices.
Right.
Four choices might be better than having 8 choices. And classical economists will say, no, how could that be? You're more likely to increase your utility if you have more choices to choose from. Well, so a maximizer is someone who, as part of his disposition, his personality trait, needs to look at all the information, make sure he got the best deal, the best card, so on. A satisficer, and satisficer is not a misstatement of satisfying. Okay. It's a specific word. To satisfy means to say good enough. It's good enough. So some of us score very highly on maximizing, others score much closer to satisfying, and that ends up predicting quite accurately how much information do you look at before you stop and commit to a choice.
Which is back to your doctor.
Back to my doctoral dissertation, exactly. Right. And so one of the things that I looked at in my, this was subsequent to my doctoral dissertation, I wanted to look at all of these various moderators that affect where people place these, what I call stopping thresholds. So one of the things that I looked at, which actually is relevant to a science salon, you'll see in a second why I'm saying this. So I had gone in 1995, this is 1 year after my PhD, to a conference in economic psychology in Bergen, Norway. And one of the guys who was speaking there is a very well-known economist, neuroeconomist, behavioral economist, George Lowenstein. And I think you might know him.
Yeah.
And he's very much part of that Thaler gang. And he was talking about the fact that in much of psychology of decision-making, the tradition that I come from, everything is viewed through the lens of cold calculation or cognitive psychology. But hot cognition, anger, lust, your blood sugar being low, all of these things affect your decision. Now, the average 4-year-old knows that. But somehow all the economists, whether they're the classical economists or the Tversky-Kahneman types, never seem to incorporate these hot cognitions. Now, as someone who was, at this point, increasingly steeped in evolutionary theory, it seemed obvious that obviously we're both cognitive creatures, but also emotional, affective creatures.
Yeah.
And so I decided to marry my original research in the stopping thresholds and look at a specific emotional moderator. Specifically, what I wanted to look at was dysphorics. Now, this goes back to linking it to my interest in clinical psychology. So dysphoria is the opposite of euphoria. It's not quite clinical depression, but it's not just the transient, I feel pissed off today. It's an enduring blue state. My dog died. I hate my job. It's not going well with my wife. So it's not quite I can't get out of bed. But it's a lot more than I'm just pissed off today.
It's a malaise.
But it's a longer malaise, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And so there's a scale that you could apply to people, a psychometric scale that measures how they score on dysphoria. And so what I wanted to do was study whether the extent of information search that people engage in prior to making a choice, whether that is moderated by one's dysphoria level. And I was very interested in this problem because, well, first it spoke to that issue that Lowenstein said, look at emotional states as part of decision-making. So I was heeding his call. But also, when I looked at the literature, every possible effect had been found. So some people had found that with greater dysphoria, you're less likely to search for information. Life sucks, who cares, why spend time? Other people thought or found and theorized that when you're dysphoric, you feel helpless. One of the ways you can gain control back in your life is to commit more resources in making a decision. Some people found no effect. Some people found curvilinear effects. So it was all over the place. So I didn't feel confident to propose any a priori hypotheses. I said, let me just see what happens. So I had, I think, maybe 16 or 17 different metrics that I had collected. I did this on what's called a process tracing interface. So on a computer interface that measures the order of information you look at, how much information you look at. So I had, I think, 17 different measures that I could compare across dysphorics and non-dysphorics. And I think on all but one, I found no difference between the two groups. So it was a very robust finding. The null effect was a very special issue in, is it on yet?
No, forget.
To a special issue in a top journal called Cognition and Emotion. And the editor of that special issue, should I say his name? I guess it's not, but it's Norbert Schwartz, who's now here at USC. He's a very well-known psychologist who was at University of Michigan. And I got back the editorial letter, and what do you think the letter said?
But I don't know.
Null effects.
Null effects, yeah.
Hey, great paper, Gad. Beautiful theorizing, beautiful methodology, great. Too bad about the null effects. Well, right?
But that's an effect.
Exactly. So I said, but
so it's the file drawer problem.
Exactly. So I said, but shouldn't we be reporting that?
Right.
Now, the fact that 16 out of 17 measures, if I remember the numbers correctly, were so robustly non-effect. Shouldn't that... Now, if somebody were to do a meta-analysis today on the relationship between dysphoria and decision-making, that study, which yielded robust null effects, would never be captured. And so you'd have a wrong view of the state of the world.
That seems like a problem in all of the social sciences. I mean, in addition to the replication problem, maybe one of the reasons for the replication problem is that the people that did replicate or were not able to replicate, we don't even know about them.
That's exactly right.
So the file drawer problem seems to be it's always bothered me in the social science.
Do you think that there is anything that we can do to try
other than this, like a journal of irreproducible results, but instead of it being a joke, it should be a real journal. I think some people have tried to make a go of that. I haven't followed that too closely. The other thing that concerns me about talking about emotions and cognition, that's the name of this journal, is that we're reifying those words into something in the head. If we deconstruct emotion and think of it as just something that makes the organism move in a certain direction or behave in a certain way. This is my behavioral Skinnerian background.
Right.
By the time you got into it, it was dead. But when I was in my first graduate program is in a Skinnerian lab, we were testing the matching law of, if we doubled the reinforcement quantity or quality on the right bar versus the left bar, would you have twice as many bar press. It's a little bit like, preferential choices.
Sure.
And it only works for a while. The curve kind of starts to slope off where they don't double the number of bar presses continually as you double the quantity or quality of reinforcement. So, but just something like the evolutionary psych finding that, men prefer 0.67 hip to waist ratio, and women prefer men with a broad shoulders and narrow waist, whatever it is, or, symmetrical faces.
Sure.
No one walks around in a nightclub with calipers going, okay, now let's see here.
Exactly.
But you don't have to, because natural selection created these emotions like, I like that.
Exactly.
What does that mean? I have a feeling. So, but we use that word like feeling or emotion like it's a thing. It's just chemistry.
Right.
Pushing the organism to act a certain way.
Right.
And so cognition would be just another kind of form of that.
Well, so you're talking about thinking versus feeling, cognition versus emotion.
Yeah.
So there's a quote which in the current version of my forthcoming book I have of yours, where it's a quote from your book, I think from the year 2000, where you're talking about the start of a debate you're having with some guy from Biola, where he says you either believe in Jesus or you don't. You either this. It's binary stuff. Right. And then you say there are people who finish the.
Well, I think there's only two type of people.
Those who make exactly.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I use that very succinct and beautiful quote is so there's a term that I've coined, epistemological dichotomania. What I mean by that is viewing always the world through these binary forces.
Right.
In many cases, these forces are not clashing with each other.
Right.
In many cases, they're false dichotomies, nature versus nurture.
Right.
And so for all sorts of reasons, this penchant to always view the world through this epistemological dichotomania lens really limits us. But I think people succumb to it because it's a nice way to do factorial designs, right? And experiments, right? High, low, high, low. Now you've got a 2x2 design, right? But the world is not oftentimes as simple as a two-factor model.
Right. Yeah. I know. It seems like, Dawkins calls this the tyranny of binary thinking or something.
Is that right?
Something like that, where, it's like recent talks about the ending of poverty. No one will be impoverished by 2030. Well, how do you define that? $1.90 cents a day or less, you're impoverished according to the UN.
Right.
So if everybody, at the lowest end make $2, there's no more poverty. Yeah, but making $2 a day isn't really not impoverished. You're just barely.
Right.
Okay, the problem is it's a continuum.
Right.
It's not a binary category. Here's poverty, here's prosperity. Oh, look, you're making $2.10 a day. You're in the prosperity category.
Right.
Dude, I'm not.
Right. Very good.
So that's, I think always an issue there.
Maybe I could go back to your waist to hip ratio example. Because that speaks to something that we briefly talked about offline. I remember saying, hey, let's talk about this. Nomological networks of cumulative evidence.
That's super interesting. What is that?
So Darwin, and you know this better than most, Darwin was the original guy, although he didn't use the term nomological networks of cumulative evidence, was the guy who, in building his evidence for the theory of natural selection, he spent several decades collecting information stemming from radically different sources. So there are these different puzzles, which when you put them all together, it becomes incontrovertible that what he's saying is veridical. Well, now let's apply it in the current parlance. So these nomological networks of cumulative evidence. So I published a paper in 2017 where I was talking about the epistemological method of EP, not methodology, running surveys or experiments. How do you actually generate knowledge when you have the evolutionary lens? And so there were three elements. Maybe I can sort of quickly go through them.
Yeah.
So number one, evolutionary theorizing differentiates between two units of analyses, the proximate level and the ultimate level. Most scientists, regrettably, only know of the existence of the proximate level. The proximate level is the how and the what of a phenomenon, right? How does diabetes work? I mean, literally, what's the mechanism? Okay. Most Nobel Prizes have been won at the proximate level. There's nothing wrong with that. much of science will operate at the proximate level. There's this additional level called the ultimate level, not ultimate in that it's superior. It took me a while to recognize that one of the pushbacks that I was getting is people were misunderstanding the word ultimate as though it were somehow an epistemologically supremacist statement. It's not. Ultimate in the Darwinian sense, in the ultimate causation sense. What's the Darwinian why for why that mechanism, that morphological feature, that behavioral signature has evolved to be of that form?
Right.
And so you need both levels of analyses to fully explain a phenomenon.
Right.
Okay? They're not competing against each other, right? So that's one thing that evolutionary theory offers you. Secondly, evolutionary theory, and I noticed here you've got a Skeptic magazine with E.O. Wilson, Consilience.
Yeah.
Consilience is where I live and breathe, right?
Yeah.
My brain thinks in a synthetic way, in a consilient way. Evolutionary theory allows you to build what I call consilient trees of knowledge, right? You start with a fundamental principle that is now inviolable.
Right.
Then you have middle-level theories. Then you have general phenomena. Then it leads you to specific hypotheses. So the knowledge that is reaped from evolutionary theory is organized in a beautiful tree of knowledge. That's why physics, chemistry, and biology seem to have more coherence. Not because a physicist is smarter than a sociologist. It's because a physicist operates within a consilient framework,
right,
whereas a sociologist doesn't. Two social scientists can't even agree whether biology matters in human affairs or not. So the starting point, you're already bifurcating into parallel universes.
Yeah.
But there are no chemists who are for the periodic table and against the periodic table, right?
Right.
So that's the second thing that evolutionary theory does, is it provides you with this potential to create consilient knowledge. But thirdly is these nomological networks of cumulative evidence. So this is a completely different way of thinking. So if I want to demonstrate this, I highlight it because you mentioned the waist to hip ratio. If I want to prove to you that the hourglass figure is an adaptive preference that men hold, the question then becomes, what is the information that I should gather to, are we good?
Yep.
What is the information that I need to gather so that I could convince you in an unassailable manner that this is truly an adaptive preference?
Yeah.
Okay. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a nomological network of cumulative evidence. So in the center of this network will be the hourglass figure. Then I'm going to get you boxes of evidence stemming from completely different paradigms, different cultures, different time periods, different frameworks, all of which, when they put them together, makes it unassailable. So let's build that nomological network for waist to hip ratio.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can get medical data that shows that women that have that hourglass figure are healthier, are more nubile. Well, that's the evolutionary stuff, right? I mean, that is literally demonstrating a link between fertility and
your phenotype.
That phenotype. Well, we could look at theoretical data that says, look, men and women have evolved, preferences that are sexually selected. So certainly the theory box is ticked. I could get you data from many, many different cultures, all of which, when you show them different silhouettes, will point to the same one. So now I'm not only using undergrads from my lab at Ohio State with 22 students. I'm actually going into the field, getting data from 50 different cultures. I'm going to the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon and showing that there is this universal preference. I can get data that comes from different elicitation techniques, not just paper and pencil. I could get eye tracking data. I could get neuroimaging data that shows that men's pleasure center in their brains light up more. There's more neural activation pattern when they see the hourglass figure. I did a study looking at the advertisements of online female escorts across 48 different countries. Very, very different countries.
Yeah.
It comes very close to 0.7.
Right.
And I'll leave the last. There are many other findings, but I'll leave this one for last because it's the most brilliant one. This study was done, I can't remember the name of the folks. They looked at congenitally blind men. So these are men who have never had the gift, have never seen anything. So they couldn't have been socialized by Oprah magazine and by whatever TV and movies and so on. Congenitally blind men have a preference for that figure. It's done through haptic touch.
They're touching something.
They're touching a mannequin. So when you put all of that information together, it becomes so unassailable that it's very difficult to argue against it. That's why I get so upset when people, usually these people, I like to call them naturally lobotomized, argue that evolutionary psychologists, all they do is engage in just so storytelling.
Right.
Because good evolutionary
psychologists,
I call them naturally lobotomized.
Oh my God. Okay. I call them, well, the people that they're blank slaters, I call them cognitive creationists.
Okay.
Because they're mostly on the left. And, evolution stopped right there. It applies down here, but not up here. Yeah.
I call them actually also flat earthers of the human mind. That's the term I used with Daniel Dennett when he came on my show. So they argue that, it's just so storytelling. The reality, though, is that a good evolutionary psychologist sets the evidentiary threshold actually much higher. And the way he or she does that, is precisely because we're trained to think using these nomological networks.
So let's look at an exception to the rule that is often given by EP critics. Something like Rubenesque, literally, paintings of big women, and that was attractive centuries ago. But with the consilient approach, you can say, that exception seems to disprove the rule, but there's 500 other studies of these other lines of evidence. How does your Rubenesque example counter all of those others?
Exactly. But although the Rubenesque example is not actually an anomaly, because when you look at the waist to hip ratio of the Rubenesque model versus the very thin model in vogue, they both, what changes is how much weight they have on their bodies. But they don't.
The ratio stays.
The ratio stays.
I didn't know that.
So it's you see what I'm saying? So although your more general point is true, and which is the following: when we talk about the hourglass figure, we don't call it a universal. Typically, we use the term near universal, precisely because it is contingent on local niches, meaning that there is an interaction between the genetic preference that's coded in my brain and yours, and local environments. In environments that have endemic caloric scarcity, men will shift. So it's as if you've got a radio dial that's set here, but then I could go this way or that way, which shows that there is behavioral malleability, behavioral plasticity. That speaks to another annoying criticism of evolutionary psychology, where people say, but you don't care about culture, or you don't care about local. No, evolutionary, as a matter of fact, there's a whole field within the evolutionary behavioral sciences called behavioral ecology. What behavioral ecologists do is they look at differences across cultures as adaptive responses. So rather than looking at human universals, they try to explain the why of why culture A does it this way and culture B does it this way. The best example of this particular phenomenon that I like to give is a field called Darwinian gastronomy. Have you heard of this one?
No.
So how many? What do you got? 3 hours? How many hours do we have? We can go on forever.
Is it food preferences?
It's differences in culinary traditions. Right. So a cultural anthropologist or a cultural psychologist simply revels in cataloging differences. The Mexicans do it this way, the French do it that way. Good night, everybody. Okay, that's fine, but who cares? If you don't explain to me what is the underlying mechanism that generates these differences, you haven't gotten to the ultimate explanation. There you go. So if we look at, say, spice use, why do the Swedes have non-spicy food, but the Mexicans have spicy food? Well, several researchers, actually from Cornell University, my alma mater, one of them is a evolutionary neuroscience type of guy. I think Sherman, I think, Paul Sherman. I think he's the one who termed the term Darwinian gastronomy. He looked at patterns of spice use around the world as a function of the ambient temperature of that culture. Now, why is that? Because food pathogens proliferate more or less depending on the ambient temperature. Spices have an antimicrobial property. This is called the antimicrobial hypothesis. So a cultural tradition evolved as an adaptive solution to a biological problem. So it's not nature or nurture. It's not culture or genes. They operate as an interaction.
Yes, very interesting. Yes, I think it's that fear that so-called blank slaters, cognitive creationists, whatever, have, that if there's a biological component at all, therefore we can't change it. And therefore, any inequalities in society must be the result of, you would say, because of biology, we can't do anything about it. I, the uber liberal, would say, no, it has to be culture so we can change it. This is a false dichotomy.
Exactly right. And incidentally, so in my forthcoming book, I talk about idea pathogens. So in the very same way that parasites can I mean, neuroparasites can parasitize animals' brains, toxicoplasma and so on.
Right, yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, this is the classic example of such a phenomenon where if a mouse is infected with this parasite, it loses its innate fear of cats, which is not a good thing. But there are many other such examples, and they're incredible because they really border on the science fiction.
Yeah.
And so I take this idea and I argue that humans suffer from another class of parasites. They're called bad ideas that parasitize our brains into doing maladaptive things. So all of these postmodernism, radical feminism, cultural relativism, identity politics, these are all idea pathogens that originally started in the ecosystem called the university. And then they spread and they have really bad downstream effects. Well, to speak to your point about blank slate and so on, many of these idea pathogens actually start off from a noble place, right? So the blank slate premise is actually quite a liberating framework. It's complete bullshit, but it's liberating in that it says, had Michael or Gad been hugged enough, they could have been the next Michael Jordan.
Right.
So if only we could engineer the environment to be conducive for anybody to become the next Michael Jordan, then everybody has equal potentiality.
Right.
So each of these idea pathogens is similarly rooted in an original noble cause, but that noble cause negates reality.
Right.
So we have to destroy the edifices of reason so that we could all feel better about the world.
Right.
And then you end up with all these idiotic ideas.
Yeah. Steve Gould was a pretty good friend of mine, and I kind of deconstructed from knowing him, his kind of obsession with debunking the idea that intelligence has a genetic component.
Right.
His famous book, The Mismeasure of Man. But he's mostly hammering 19th, early 20th century social Darwinism and other, sort of biologically determinist arguments that turned out not to be very well made.
Right.
And so I kind of see the point all the way up to where the research got much better in the 50s and 60s and so on, that kind of gets ignored by the blank slaters. But you can really see the concern. I mean, he was a secular Jew, but sensitive to oppression of peoples that had been pretty horrific, and the way people were treated in terms of cataloging them by their IQ scores, and or any kind of medical thing. Like there's a famous case called drapetomania, which is the tendency for blacks to try to escape from slavery. This is a disorder they have, and we have to cure this because they supposed to want to be slaves. This is good for them. This is their place.
That's the default state.
Yeah, that's the default state. And so Gould talked about all those kinds of things. So when you read him in the context, like, okay, I can see why people then end up being concerned about the Charles Murrays of the world or whatever.
But do you think, and I often ask this question of people with whom I have these wonderful conversations in different variations, do you think that Gould, since you knew him, or other folks similar to him, who are otherwise obviously intelligent, sophisticated people, did he believe this BS in the deep recesses of his mind when he goes to bed at night and puts his head on the pillow?
What's the BS?
There are no IQ differences. The blank slate premise, the Lewontin stuff where he hates EP because of his Marxist background.
Right.
Is it just that they engage in this self-deception on steroids so that they truly believe it?
I think so.
Okay.
I think he truly believed it. Although he would always say, of course, I'm not saying that there's no biological element, or I'm not saying this. It's enough of a qualification to deal with, some things you would throw back. Oh yeah, I know that's true, but so I do think, well, although ideologies are powerful, it's one of your
idea pathogens.
Idea pathogens, for sure. The question is but which are the right ideas or the wrong ideas, or good, better or worse ideas, because they do have an effect on our thinking that way. So I'm often conflicted about the whole race and IQ thing. When I was, again, in graduate school, already, this is when Arthur Jensen was in the hot seat and talking about these race and IQ differences. And my psych professor showed, there are these racial group differences, and they are clear, 15 points and so on. I'm like, okay. But I don't think I'd want to go into that field.
Right.
So I'm always curious why people want to go into that field. It's going to be trouble. And maybe it's a pure pursuit of truth, and we'll get past the social implications. And yes, there were some bad things a century ago of how people misuse that information. But on the other hand, why obsess about that? And I still kind of conflicted about that.
So I'll tell you a personal story that happened to me with probably the most famous of the race and IQ people. Can you think of another name other than later than after Arthur Jensen?
Before Charles Murray?
Around Murray. He died pretty recently, about 5 years ago.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Philip Rushton.
Oh, Philip Rushton. Yes, I know all about him because we kind of we did an issue of Skeptic defending his right to free speech.
Right.
Because he was in trouble, and I forget what Canadian university.
University of Western Ontario.
He was like vilified, and he had this whole thing about K-selected versus R-selected species, and blacks have larger penises than whites, and Asians are smaller. How did you get this data? Condom companies, like, holy shit, who does this?
Right.
I mean, I can't imagine going to a condom company. Okay, do you have any data on Asians versus blacks versus what?
Right. So here's the personal story.
Yeah.
So at the 1996 International Congress of Psychology, which was held that year in Montreal, my home city, I was speaking on data that, so I finished my PhD in 1994. So one of the things that I looked at in my doctoral dissertation, on the stopping threshold, I looked at how time pressure affects where you set these thresholds. Not surprisingly, when you're under time pressure, you look at less information. And so what you do is you relax the threshold so that you can hit the threshold quicker. Okay. And so I was going to present data. This is not at all controversial. This is sort of hardcore cognitive psychology, decision making.
Yeah.
So I'm speaking at this conference. The room is packed, maybe 1,500 people. And I know they're not there for me because I was a nobody. I was just finished my PhD 2 years earlier. Now, I had made the mistake of not seeing who the other people in my session were. No. So I think you know where the story is going.
Oh my God.
So before I got up to speak, Rushton, and so now I realize why everybody's there. There's probably about 1,500 people in the room.
Oh my God.
And you can sense, and he's doing his whole black-white cranial volume, the whole thing, right? And I'm thinking, I'm going to get lynched by proxy. I'm dead. And I'm someone who doesn't feel very nervous speaking in front of crowds, but I was truly nervous because I could read the room. Now, the good news is that the minute that he finished, out of the maybe 1,500 people that were there, 1,425 followed him out as he made an exit. Yeah. And so when I got up to speak, there were one person here, one person here. And I was very, very pleased that the room was pretty empty. So I've since spoken to several people who've known Rushton, and I've always asked them, so what's the bottom line? Was he racist? Did he? The general feel I got back from them is, and I can't vouch for the veracity of the secondhand information, is that no, he was a purist, and he thought that this was valuable information. That there's no theoretical reason to presume that there shouldn't be selection pressures on and theoretically speaking, there is no reason to presume that, right? And therefore, I'm doing the research. I never heard from any of the people who knew him well. No, believe me, deep down inside, he was a KKK guy. Oh. So I don't know. What do you think?
No, I've never heard that either. And it's irrelevant, but socially we want to know. But no, I've never heard that he was. And I know Charles Murray too, and I don't think he's a racist at all. But again, it's like, okay, but why do you want to go down that path? Why is that interesting to you?
So the way I would answer it is, I've been asked on many occasions, is there any forbidden knowledge that you wouldn't? And my answer is always an unequivocal no. Because
but not forbidden, like the academy should never study this, but you personally.
Let somebody else worry about it. But then if we do that, don't we then succumb to the tragedy of the commons where nobody ends up doing it?
But you can't study everything. So you study behavioral finance. Why didn't you go into race and IQ differences as a research?
Okay. Yeah, for whatever reason, it didn't tickle my fancy.
Okay.
But what I'm saying is, I would not, I am the purveyor of all grants in the world. I would not say, oh, hey, don't you dare study that.
I see, right.
Right? I'm saying all bets are off. As long as you stay true to the scientific method, I don't care what you say.
That's my argument too, I know James Flynn, and he and I did a target article for a journal that I commented on with a bunch of other people. And basically his argument, which I agreed with in defense of free speech, is that he really wanted to know exactly what the science says. He's an uber liberal, and he does not want racial differences in IQ to have an effect in equal society, that we should do something about that, whatever the cause, and the only way to know is to really study it hard. So he does. And this is how he discovered the Flynn effect. IQ scores are going up 3 points every 10 years. He was the one that figured it out because he wanted to know, Are there really racial differences? Is it biological? Is it cultural? What do we know? This is how we discovered. So in a way, I mean, his argument, just somebody should do it and put it out there, and no holds barred, unless but we can still have our ideologies, our social attitudes,
right.
Which should hold and stand regardless of how the science comes out. So right. I believe that people should be treated equally under the law, regardless of their IQs.
Right.
So it comes out this way or it comes out that way, it's irrelevant. We still think people should be treated equally under the law, and this is why I think we have to keep them separated.
Right.
Anyway, that's my counter argument to that, and I even think, like with the Holocaust deniers, David Irving, let him publish his stuff. Give him a platform. I did several times in Skeptic. Here's his arguments, and I steel man him. Like, all right, David, give me your 10 best arguments why you think the Holocaust didn't happen, or whatever it is you think, and then just swat them down. End of story. Next,
right?
And as opposed to what he likes, I know this, because I know David, he likes to be suppressed. So he goes, see, I'm onto something. Right. The traditional enemy, which is the Jews.
And of course, there's the Jews who are suppressing it.
That's right.
Well, listen, when people ask me where I stand on free speech, the way that I demonstrate that I'm a true free speech absolutist is I actually give the exact example of the Holocaust deniers. When I was a doctoral student at Cornell, at the time, I can't remember his name, but we could probably easily find it. There was a gentleman who was going around to all of the top universities speaking about the data showing that the Holocaust never happened. And I actually support his right to be a Holocaust denier. I'm Jewish. So by definition, it is almost inconceivable to find something more offensive than telling a Jewish person that the Holocaust never happened. And I support your right to be an idiot.
When your right to be an idiot.
Exactly. When Satoshi Kanazawa, do you know who he is? No. Satoshi Kanazawa is an evolutionary psychologist who had a bombastic, I say had, you'll see in a second why I'm saying in the past tense, he was a Psychology Today blogger who had a huge following on Psychology Today. And at one point, he wrote an article where he was simply reporting on data from some survey, not his research, someone else's research, looking at attractiveness preferences across races. Black women were judged as less attractive than white women, whatever it was. Okay, maybe he didn't use nice language, maybe the title that he used for clickbait purposes was a bit obnoxious, but there was unbelievable furor against him. People not only thought that he should be removed from being a columnist at Psychology Today, but that they should revoke his tenure at the London School of Economics because he's a rabid racist. He's a Japanese guy, so he's not a white supremacist from Arkansas. So he's a person of color. And I was probably the only one who wrote an article, this is, I think, back in 2010, where I said, purging a blogger sets a dangerous precedent. If he is saying racist things, let that racism shine through. Let his words serve as his punishment, right?
Yeah.
You can't imagine how many people wrote to me, some of them pretty prominent, saying, thank you for writing this, but I don't have the courage to have taken that position.
Right.
That annoys me. What frustrates me is the amount of cowardice that so many of our intellectual colleagues exhibit. And so few of us have the fortitude to actually put our heads up.
So let's bring two of these threads together, behavioral finance and economics, and our concerns about social issues with social media and these tech giants that are now being on trial with Congress and so on about having a monopoly. Do we need to regulate them to adjust the utility maximizing of social media or whatever? Or do you think the market could actually correct things with competitive YouTube, competitive Twitter, whatever?
I'll start off by saying I'm utterly confused about what my position is.
Okay.
Because I can truly see valuable arguments on both sides. I think this is a demonstration of epistemic humility. I always tell people, when I know something or think that the evidence is on my side, I walk with all the right swagger. When I don't know something, I've got the epistemic humility to say, I don't know. Yeah. So I'll start off by saying I don't know. There are really, as you know, the market is already correcting with Patreon.
Yes,
right. So this is what you just asked is very timely.
Right.
I've lost.
That's what I was thinking of.
I've lost about half my Patreon supporters.
You did.
Now I didn't have the type of support that some of these friends that we have had. I was at my most. I was probably making around $3,000 a month, and then after the Lawrence Southern thing happened, I don't know if you know, about a year ago,
Right.
they went after this journalist, a freelance journalist from Canada.
Yeah.
That brought me down by about half. And now with the Carl Benjamin, the Sargon of Akkad guy,
Right.
now I'm another half down. So I'm probably at around a quarter of whatever I was at my most.
Right.
I'm probably now around 300 something patrons. At my most, I was at 750, 800.
So you think these are protest votes against, not you, against patrons?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But of course,
you were hurt by it.
Exactly. So I appreciate the fact that that's how they want to punish, but they're punishing a whole bunch of other people that have absolutely nothing to do with it.
Right.
So I mean, my intuition says that there probably needs to be some sort of government oversight of these folks, in the same way that there's government. I'm a strong capitalist. I'm a strong libertarian, but the government does have to step in and regulate certain things. So my intuition is, yes, the market could correct some of these problems, but we probably need to have some government oversight.
Yeah.
What's your feeling?
I think that, well, yeah, I'm always worried about governments intervening when they think there's a problem that may not be a problem.
Okay.
So like when the State Department or the FTC, I guess, sued Microsoft as a monopoly when they bundled Netscape and forced everybody to take that if you're going to buy the Microsoft product. Okay, but by the time that ground through the courts, it took for 3 or 4 years.
Right.
The Netscape was dead anyway. So it's like by the time the government would get in to regulate things, there's probably hopefully going to be competitors for YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. I don't know what that would be. Somebody with a lot more money than you and I have come in and go, okay, you know what? I'm sick and tired of this. I'm going to do this.
Right.
And now someone like Peter Thiel, who could afford to do it, but he's on Facebook's on their board, corporate board, so he can't do it. But there's got to be somebody to do that.
Yeah. What amazes me, I mean, as someone who not only studies it, but also lectures on psychology and decision making, I'm amazed that someone like Jack Conte, the owner or founder or whatever of Patreon, how there's been so little public introspection on his part.
Just to let you know that we had some tech issues, but that's okay. We're going to try to seg out to the bigger picture. You've written several leading textbooks and hundreds of scholarly papers on these particular specific issues of behavioral finance, behavioral economics, evolutionary economics. Your next book is a rather different subject and grander subject for you. Also trade, not a scholar, not a textbook.
Just to correct you, the other ones weren't textbooks. 2 of them were academic books, meaning for other academics. One was a trade book.
Okay.
This is another trade book. That's not evolutionary based, other than the fact that the way ideas spread could be considered an evolutionary mechanism, right? So the field of evolutionary epistemology or memetics would certainly. So I do apply the biological metaphor, as I mentioned earlier, of how brain parasites can parasitize different organisms to idea pathogens. Right. And again, the idea here of idea pathogens is that many things that we end up doing are terribly maladaptive precisely because they end up parasitizing our ability to think straight. So, for example, when someone starts off with the idea of open borders is the only way to go, and short of that, you are a rabid Nazi KKK member, no sane, logical, rational person could actually propose such a position if they weren't parasitized by a bunch of these idea pathogens. And so what I do is I look at various truly important issues that we face in the world today and demonstrate that the genesis of these forms of suicidal stupidity stem from originally the ecosystem of the universities. I don't know if it was Orwell who said something to the effect of, only intellectuals can come up with such stupid ideas, or something to that effect. That literally is true. So postmodernism and identity politics and the cultural relativism and radical feminism and the rejection of what I call biophobia, the fear of biology and explaining human affairs. All of these things, only intellectuals.
Biophobia, I like that.
Only intellectuals can come up with such stupidity.
So you're doing for the university what Dawkins did with religion and the God delusion.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people say, "Oh, but come on, aren't you just exaggerating the effect of these?" I mean, so you got a couple of social justice warriors. No, because these guys. I mean, Justin Trudeau, the prime minister of a leading Western country, is a product of having been parasitized by a tsunami of these idea pathogens. Right? He grew up in that highfalutin progressive thing, and now we suffer the consequences. Look, I held a chaired professorship, university-wide chair for 10 years, and I applied for the next chair, which should have been a shoo-in, frankly, with all due modesty. I didn't get it, no doubt, because I failed on some of the immutable metrics that come now with the equity and diversity calculus. The Canada Research Chairs, which is the chaired professorships that are endowed by the Canadian government, now have to abide by equity and diversity. So the place where a meritocracy should be the ethos that is guiding our how we met out grants, how we is now gone. It's all about whether you are Indigenous woman who's also transgender.
Right. So I was a little conflicted about this until about a year ago or so, because like if you go to Chapman University where I teach, or your university, I give talks at public talks, you walk around campus, you don't see much.
Right.
There's not like constant protests or anything like that. So it's not the occasional eruptions that happen that end up on Tucker Carlson's campus craziness for the week. You can always find a few clips. You're more worried about this sort of deep-rooted, institutionalized.
Absolutely. And it's not the explosion that matters. It's the stuff that you don't pick up. So, example, I receive innumerable. I could fill up this whole house with the letters and emails that I receive from professors, from students, from staff who say, I'm afraid to open my mouth. Well, nobody's picking that up. That person is suffering in silence, short of sending me that email. Now, imagine if 10%, 20%, 30% of the students, and that's probably a gross underestimate, are feeling that. That's where the intellectual terrorism comes in. It's not just for you to see the explosion. It's the fact that you're supposed to be going to this university setting so that you can explore ideas, expand your mind, and everybody is afraid of their shadow. Everybody is afraid of uttering one word out of place. That's intellectual terrorism.
I ask my students every semester, how many of you self-censor when you're talking to...
All of them.
All of them. Every hand goes up.
That's it. There it is.
And not just with me, but with each other. They're afraid to speak out.
I mean, I gave a talk at the Manning Conference, which is a political conference that happens once a year in Canada. Manning was a prominent politician. So I guess you would probably consider him libertarian, to use the nomenclature of the United States. And so I spoke at the Manning Conference on these campus freedom of speech issues. All I did for my talk is read emails.
You did?
That's all I did. No, I didn't give the identity of the person. I removed any identifying things. If they said I work at this lab, I removed that. All I did was read that. And I asked people to simply imagine if what I was reading was coming from Canada and the US or from North Korea. You couldn't tell where it's coming from. That's the level of fear. So a guy will write to me and say, I work in a cognitive science lab, and my professor found out that I said something nice about Trump, and now my name has been removed from a paper. What? I mean, This is not hyperbole. This is if it's only happened to one person, that's already a disaster. And it's not one person. It's professors writing me saying, how do you have the courage to speak the way that you do? I'm afraid to open my mouth in a departmental meeting. Well, I want all those people to have a voice.
In a way, this is even more dangerous than religion, because we've mainly tamed the bad parts of religion, with a few exceptions here and there. But secular universities and the academy is pervasive everywhere.
It's everywhere.
And those kids graduate and they go into the corporate world.
And government.
And government.
And I mean, James Damore,
Yes,
I mean, that's Google. Not university, that's Google. Do no evil. Is that
don't be
evil. Okay. So it's not hyperbole, it's not exaggeration. The other thing I would say is, oftentimes people say, but what percentage of the students are the hardened social justice warriors? My rebuttal is always this: how many terrorists did it take to bring down the...
19.
19. Did it take 19 million, 19,000, 19 billion? It took 19. And now our psyche is damaged forevermore. It took 19 people. So you don't need 17 million people to be walking around on campus with red hair. You need enough people to cause enough of a chilling environment, and the intellectual terrorists have won. Now, the solution is very simple. If everybody would simply speak, I know it sounds obvious, but diffuse the responsibility onto many people, not 4 of us speak. You could probably count on 2 hands the number of professors who are still professors who speak out. 2 hands is probably maybe too many, maybe 1 hand. That's not right. right?
Yeah.
And I don't need your private support. I don't need you to send me a letter. I mean, I like it, thank you. But I don't need you to send me a letter, you're such a hero, Professor Saad, but please don't release my name. Once you say, please don't release my name because you're supporting me, you're part of the problem. You're a coward.
Right. Yes, although I can see why people who are, have a family and need an income and they're afraid of getting fired.
I didn't get many jobs in Southern California, the promised land, because of my. So people think, oh, you have tenure, you're Superman, you're bulletproof. All the death threats that I received would not go away because of tenure. So people think,
you have tenure, I was going to shoot you.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm about to behead you. I'm an Islamist who's about to behead you. You got tenure. I can't touch you, man. Right. Last year, in fall of 2017, the number of threats that I was getting was so high that when I was coming to the university, I was being escorted by security.
Wow.
They would lock the door from the outside so that people can go out but couldn't get back in.
Right.
I would go to the university feeling so worried, am I going to be picked up, live long enough to be picked up by my wife? When my wife would pick me up, I'd feel an incredible existential relief that I made it through another week.
Right.
We had to file a report with the Montreal police. Tenure didn't protect me there.
Right.
So it is so, if nothing else, obnoxious for people to say, but of course you could speak, you're tenured.
Right.
Believe me, the costs that you bear are quite high.
Yeah.
And I bear them because I can't go to bed at night and feel good about myself if I keep my mouth shut. And I wish more people would feel the same way.
Now, to what extent is it ideology bubbling up into the corporate world and government agency? We have to do the following and having training programs and fire these people and have these rules so we don't get sued.
I think it's a bit of both. I think they're not mutually exclusive. But again, I think the patient zero, right, to continue with the biological metaphor, right? The disease spreads at some point, somewhere, and there's a patient zero of AIDS, right? Well, the patient zero of idea pathogens is the universities. This is why professors are really in the best position to be fighting against the infestation of these bad ideas.
Right.
That's where it originates from, and that's where we have to fight it at ground zero. Right. So the idea that, but I'm too busy in my lab to do my own work and so on, that's again cowardly. Right. You are trained as an intellectual. Look outside your narrow area of expertise. Contribute to the greater battle of ideas. And again, to go back to one of our original points, I come from a culture and a society where these freedoms weren't guaranteed. So I really do appreciate how easily some of these freedoms can be taken away from us.
So to counter that, this couldn't happen in America, maybe in the Middle East, I can see that, but here we have these protections. But it is happening.
It is happening.
Yeah.
I think Ronald Reagan said, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact quote, that every single generation there are huge intrusion against liberties, and we have to be mindful to protect. In other words, the nefarious forces are always there, and you have to always be on the lookout. That's the bottom line.
Right.
It's only because the West has had it so good for so long that you think it can't come here.
Right.
But it can. Now, I don't mean to sound so alarmist that tomorrow we're all going to be under martial law and Sharia law, but it's bit by bit. It's the old, I know that the parable doesn't quite hold out the scientific, the boiling frog thing, but let's assume that it's the old, in marketing you call it the just noticeable difference, right?
Oh, right.
And,
yes, right.
The just noticeable difference, when you're taking a candy bar and you want to increase the price of the candy bar, you don't want to increase the price because people are cognizant of the price increase. So what do? You decrease the weight of the bar.
Right.
So if it's at 100 grams, you want to reduce it psychophysically so that at 90 grams, nobody can still tell the difference. So you want to fall below the just noticeable difference.
Right.
That's what's happening to the intrusion of our liberties.
It's a great analogy.
Thank you. It's bit by bit, right? It doesn't matter. I don't notice it. I'm too busy buying my tomatoes at the grocery store. It's my daughter's birthday. I got to prepare for the dinner party.
Right.
Let somebody else worry about that. Right. No, that's how the enemies of reason get a foothold. Do your part. However small your voice, however big, you've got a voice, use it.
On that point, Nadine Strauss's book, Hate, Countering Hate Speech with Free Speech, and she makes the point, which just knocked me off my chair. If we had these criteria back that hate speech is violence and therefore people should be silenced, anti-slavery abolitionists in the 19th century would have been banned from all the southern states. You can't come down here and say that stuff. This could lead to
that's violence.
That's violence, and it could do that.
Right.
You know, there's some of these slave revolts were that. So, you know, again, more free speech is always the solution, I think. You know, almost no. I mean, yeah, you can't give the nuclear codes to the Soviets.
Right.
Okay, that's not free speech. But that's not what we're talking about. So, what's the forthcoming working title of the book? Yeah.
So right now it's called The Parasitic Mind, precisely because
Right.
these parasites.
Right.
It might change. I might want a title that's a bit more prescriptive, right? Because I think that people don't want to just hear about the malady. They want to hear how to solve the malady.
Okay.
So something
Right.
that says how to better think and you know.
Right.
So right now the working title is The Parasitic Mind, but it might change. And it should be, I have to have the draft submitted by October. So my hope is that by early,
2020. After the election, hopefully.
Exactly. That's what
you don't want to compete with the. Yeah.
And actually, the publisher said exactly that.
Yeah.
So they're pushing me to finish it quickly enough.
Yeah. Do not release a book in 2020 because there's going to be 100
Trump books,
anti-pro, whatever. Yeah,
Right.
You don't want to mess with that. Well, Gad, what you're doing, I would say you're doing God's work, but we're atheists. So.
I'm doing God's work.
Gad's work. You're doing Gad's work. Yes. Yeah. I like how you do a play on that. That's really clever. You're one of the most interesting people I've met these days working in
so much.
just the general area of science, freedom, liberty, free speech. All this, to me, it's a package deal. They go hand in hand. Freedom of inquiry in science, freedom of speech and society. They're the same thing. The only way to get to the truth is to talk.
Well, I'm honored to have you now as a personal friend.
Likewise, guys.
Cheers,
Thanks.
buddy.